Hey, come state, amici miei? How are all of you guys? So it's Eric, the Rick, Pitaluga, however you want to pronounce the italic or the American way to say it, right? I am your favorite. Can't see my weight. There we go. Boom. Trigger finger. I am your favorite Genoese Cuban because there ain't many of those. Now, there are some Italians in Cuba in Pinar del Rio and maybe Havana where other places are. But yeah, so if you're new to this channel, I'm casual. I don't update all the time. But, my grandfather, as you'll see in this picture right here, had blonde hair and blue eyes, and he was 100% European, born in Pinar del RIo, Mantua, Cuba, which is named after Mantova, Italy. And the saint of the snow is the same as in Genoa, because my last name is Pitaluga. There's my Cuban grandma, right? You guys see me, right? Here's my dad, my mom. My mom is Polish and Anglo-Saxon. My dad is Italian and Cuban. Uh, so there we go. All right. So as you can see here, Mr. Sweet says Pitaluga, which means to pick grapes in Genoese, the language of Genoa, is an Italian last name, right? Just so you're sure, right? And then here, Heraldry Institute of Roma says that Pitaluga is an Italian name, Liguria, Genovese. Io sono Genovese. I'm Genoese, like Columbus, right? Columbus was Italian, all this other stuff, right? I just talked to my Italian tutor about that, like how. Anyway, I'll get on to the video. I know we're a minute in, but yes, just to make sure, Pitaluga, Pitaluga, as well as Picaluga, Piccaluga, 1T, 2Ts. It's all the same last name. There were Pitalugas in France and Spain as well, so I mean, you know, anyway, onto the video. So we got ahead of ourselves. So the Bronze Age, right? So this is my father's DNA. I did a video for my DNA. This is my father's DNA. So 50% European farmer, right? Okay. Uh, Northwest African under a percent. Central Steppe. That's where 28. No, that's Western Steppe. Western Central. Wait, which one is it? 2.8, 2.8. Where is this? Oh, Central Steppe. Where is that? Here. Yeah, 28%. Let's zoom out. Right, so that's more back here, right? Central Steppe. Uh, right. Arabian, none of that. Anatolia shows up. Siberian, a little bit of Jomon, right? Because my grandma's Cuban DNA has some Japanese at some point, and then 1% South American Indian. So I mean, yeah. So in the Bronze Age, let's see here. 1% of my dad's ancestors were Native American. Uh, and 7% were sub-Sahara African. That's really about it. Caucasian and Anatol whatever, all that's like Caucasian. So, what does ChatGPT have to say about that? So, the Bronze Age. At the dawn of civilization, my father's DNA was shaped by two major forces: the first European farmers and the nomads from the Pontic Caspian steppe. Over 50% of his ancestry came from early Mediterranean agriculturists, the same people who would later spread into Iberia and the Italian peninsula. Another 20% came from central steppe herders, the ancestors of Indo-European speakers. A smaller amount, just over 10%, came from the Caucasus, linking him to ancient traders and mountain societies that fed into the Mediterranean basin. Rounding out his profile were trace influences from sub-Saharan Africa and South Amerindians, pointing to far ahead in this Cuban future. So let's go ahead to the Iron Age. All right, and here's where we really concretely know. Sorry, yeah, that's right there. That I am Genoese, right? Because the ancient Genoese peoples, the Liguri, modern day Liguria, but in the ancient times it was Liguri, were Celtic peoples, right? They had reddish brown hair, kind of like Count Cagliostro from Lupin the Third, the Castle of Cagliostro, right? And they had very blue or green eyes. My grandfather had blue eyes, of course, but he had Spaniard mixed in as well, and German and English, as you'll see here as well, because his insular Celt 13%. But ChatGPT will go over the ancestry in a minute, But yeah, so the northwest Italy, right? Because if you notice, Italic and Etruscan 0%. So it's like I have Italian ancestors, but my dad has Italian ancestors that were Italic and Etruscan during the Iron Age. but it's under 0.1%, and Sicilian under 1%. The Berber, so Cubans have Canarian, and Canary Islands were conquered by the Moors, so the native Guanche peoples, so of course he has a little bit of Berber. Iberian, only 3.8% Spanish in the Iron Age from my dad. Yeah, but what's also interesting here is the Sardinian 8.8. So this Italian island right here of Sardinia, right below Corsica, Sardinia. A lot of Genoese people have ancestry from there and migrated and colonized there from Genoa, Sardinia, this island. So it's noticeable that he has roughly 9% of that, and if you compound all that with the continental Celt, that's a significant portion of his ancestry would be from Liguria. So, by the Iron Age, my father's ancestors were firmly rooted in continental Celtic Europe, with over 50% descending from Gaulish and Iberian Celtic tribes. The tribes spread through what are now France, northern Italy, and Iberia, a direct reflection of his Genoese and Spanish ancestry. Additional ancestry came from insular Celts of the British Isles, which makes sense given that his Genoese colonial line from Pinar del RIo included Anglo-Saxon ancestry, modern Anglo-Saxon colonial North American United States colonial American in him, likely tied to British settlers or merchants in Mantua or Havana. His profile also reflected ancient Anatolian and Sardinian heritage, signals commonly found in Mediterranean port cities like Genoa, and again traces of African or indigenous Cuban DNA confirm the blending that occurred later in the New World. Okay, so now let's go over to the Roman age, and again, guys, this is on global tailoring, so this is just generic all across. It's not favoring any group over the other. So Roman Iberia 51.4, Roman Italy 14.4, Pict, which is like Scottish, 12.6, Roman Gaul 11.2, Sub-Saharan African 5.8, Roman Sardinia 1.8, Alaska, where is that? Oh, it's like, yeah, it's like in the Middle East. Okay, South Amerindian under 1%. Indian subcontinent, what is that? Oh, that's like actual Indian in like, you know, South Asia. Under 0%, Roman Britain and Germanic and Baltic and Visigoth, Roman Pannonia, Illyria, Levant, Japanese, of course, because like I told you, there were some Chinese or Japanese or intermix of both, you know, people in Cuba. So, what does ChatGPT have to say? So, as the Roman Empire reached its peak, my father's genetic roots spread across key Roman provinces. Over half of his ancestry found in Roman Iberia, confirming a strong foundation in Spanish colonial bloodlines. Nearly 15% came from Roman Italy, clearly tying him to his Genoese grandfathers. Ligurian origin. Smaller portions were, well, it's not, my grandfather, not, okay, ChatGPT actually made a hiccup there. Smaller portions were found in Roman Gaul or Pictish Britain, aligning with the French, British, and Mediterranean intermingling common in port cities. A unique trace from Roman Sardinia and even Lazica, and the Caucasus suggests a deep Genoese merchant network. As always, traces of Sub-Saharan African and South American DNA came back to Cuba, the product of transatlantic migrations that came long after Rome fell. Alright, so now let's go to the Middle Ages, and now we have Iberian, 42.4, France, 26.4, Insular Celt, 10.8, that's the British, Sardinian, 9.4, Sub-Saharan African, 6.2, Cardavillian, what is that? Middle Eastern, so like another 3% of the Middle Eastern group. You know, Sub-Saharan, or whatever, North African 1.2, again, the Berbers, the Canary Islands from my grandmother's, my Cuban grandma, and under 1% Amerindian, and 0% Slavic, Baltic, Crimea, European Jew, European Jew at some point, because that makes sense, I mean, banking and stuff like that, you know. So Jews dealt with the money mainly. That's just how it was, you know. So my dad is like under 0.1% Jewish. Awesome. Italian, right? It's like family. Italians are not Jews. You know, with the nose, right? Yeah. So, Middle Ages. In the Middle Ages, the Roman world had faded, but Europe was reborn through kingdoms, noble houses, and maritime republics. My father's dominant ancestry came from medieval Iberia, accounting for over 40%, and reflects the families who would eventually populate the Spanish colonies, including Cuba. Another 26% came from medieval France, reinforcing his grandmother's Castilian-French blend, but also matching his Genoese grandfather's merchant class tied to southern France. His insular, and that's true, the Genoese ancestry, his insular Celtic ancestry continued to reflect Anglo roots, likely absorbed into Cuba from colonial settlers, diplomats, or sailors stationed in Havana or Mantua during the British occupational period of Cuba, shortly after the Spanish colonial founding of Cuba. Sardinian ancestry again showed up, preserved through Mediterranean connections, and once again African indigenous ancestry appeared, modest but present, woven into the fabric of Cuba's colonial legacy. So, what do we make of this? Your father's Genoese grandfather, the blonde. It's okay. Yeah, I just checked. I clearly stated that it's my father's father, not his grandfather, whatever. But whatever, I don't know why it's making that hiccup. ChatGPT isn't perfect yet. So, the blonde Pitaluga from Pinar del RIo carried with him centuries of maritime nobility. Genoa was not only a power in Italy, but one of the great financial engines of Spain's empire, funding voyages to the Americas and establishing merchant colonies from Sicily to the Canary Islands and eventually to Cuba. Genoese merchants are known to have settled in Havana during the 16th and 17th centuries, including some who were involved in the shipping trade and tax collection. Interestingly, your father's DNA migration group includes Virginia, which, along with Genoese records of traders' arrival in colonial America, opens the door to the possibility of Genoese families or their descendants through Spain were present in early British American settlements, particularly as financiers, sailors, or intermediaries. Your father's DNA story across four major historical eras is a perfect representation of the Atlantic world. Genoese merchant nobility from Liguria, Spanish and Canarian settlers who built the New World colonies, French and Anglo roots woven through both Cuba and colonial Europe, African and indigenous town choices inherited through Cuba's long colonial arc, just ancient European farmers, from ancient European farmers to medieval seafarers, and from Moorish Andalusia to colonial Virginia. The past is not just remembered, it is written in blood. So that's very cool and everything. Wow, guys, look at that timestamp. Look at how much time passed. It did deep research. So here is an overview of, you know, uh, my dad's total Cuban heritage, the white and the average, almost Criollo, mestizo, Cuban class, and then of course here was his modern, which I did in other videos, right? And if you want to see a video about just Genoese, like ancient Genoese DNA and what their ancient profiles would have looked like individually, I did that with my true ancestry in another video, and I'll leave that in the description. But yeah, so my dad, he's 2.7% Native American, 1.4 Central African, 3.2 Moroccan, 3.6 Algerian. So what is that? That's a grand total Moroccan. Well, Moroccans with Canarians. That's like, like Wanch Canarians are almost kind of white. So that's like North African, like Egyptian stuff. That's like modern day standards. That's white. But the right, so roughly 7% black and 3 right. So he's 10%, right, so right, yeah, he should be about like 85 to 90% white. Yeah, of course, my Italian grandfather, again, I proved in the video I'm Italian and stuff, so it comes up as Portuguese, Spanish, and Cuban and Spain, Canary Islands. 1.5%, so some of that Portuguese belongs to my grandmother, and then 1.5% South Italian, representing Genoa, because Genoese royalty intermarried in southern Italy, as you'll see with what ChatGPT probably said. I didn't read it yet. But 35.4% Spain, Spanish, Catalan, and Basque. There's no French probably because the Basque is, of course, in the middle of Spain and France. It's probably absorbing it, in the Catalan as well. So yeah, all right. So let's get into it. Wait, real quick. So I've showed you guys this before, but so we did the medieval ages, and stuff like that. So a lot of Basque, as you'll see here, and southern, right? Not Italy yet. In this time period, although it wasn't ancient as we saw. England, Germany, France, right? Again, this is just my Italian grandfather from 1600. So then you see here is specifically in Genoa and in Sicily, right? And more Basque, all for him, and more like Anglo-Saxon and Germanic and French, right? And now like deeper into southern Italy, as well as more Genoa, more Basque, but now also a lot of Castilian, right? And more on the Sicilian specifically, still Genoa. like Swiss areas, like more on the Anglo-Saxon than the Scottish there. That makes sense. 1750 to 1800, that makes sense. A lot more on the West Sicilian as opposed to the East earlier. Now it's a lot of Galician. That's probably where the Portuguese comes from, the more recent ancestry, like heavy on the Germanic, as you can see it's darker there. And then this is where it's like mostly just a lot of, like, as you can see as you back up, southern Italy and then Roman with the Galician, right? Right, and then here it's just Spanish, really. Spanish and German. And that makes sense because I forgot what house was that? It's the most well-known German house that did business with Spain. It starts with an H, I think. The Hilbergs. I don't know. Every historian knows. But anyway, so Genoa's connections to colonial Cuban heritage. Genoese merchants in the Spanish Empire. Genoa played a pivotal role in the Spanish Empire from the 16th century onward. After 1550, Genoese bankers became the financial backbone of Spain's imperial expansion, financing wars and colonial enterprises. Historian Ferdinand Brattle famously dubbed 1557 to 1627 the Age of the Genoese, where discreet Genoese influence dominated Spanish finances in exchange for extending credit to the Habsburg. There we go. That's funny how that came up, right? Habsburg crown. Genoese financiers received payment in the New World silver, quickly transferring American bullion to Seville, the Genoese banks, to further ventures. Genoese merchant bankers thus integrated deeply into the Spanish imperial systems, not as conquerors, but as moneyed men, trade contact, asiento in the Caribbean from earlier Flemish, Dutch, Belgian intermediaries. In Seville, the hub of America's trade, Genoese trading houses secured royal licenses to supply the enslaved Africans to Cuba and the Indies. Well, that is what it is. The formal role within Spain's colonial economy. It shows how Genoese families became trusted partners of the Spanish crown. Many Genoese merchants accepted Spanish titles and offices, fully integrating into colonial administration. Genoese noble families, wealthy from maritime trade, forged close relations with the Spanish court and adopted Spanish customs. A cultural blending that eased their entry into imperial society. For example, Ambrosio Spinola, Genoese patrician, became a celebrated Spanish general in the 1600s, illustrating how Genoese elites could convert mercantile success into noble status within Spain's empire. Okay, that makes sense, right? I'm a Hispanicized Genoese person, as documented with books by people like Matteo Salogna in Matteo Salogna's book, Genoa's Freedom, Entrepreneurship, Republicanism, and the Spanish Atlantic. So, of course, became right. This deep integration set this stage for Genoese involvement in Spain's Atlantic colonies, from the Canary Islands to Cuba. From the Canary Islands to Cuba, Genoa's connection to Spain's colonies began even before Columbus. Italian, especially Genoese, expertise heavily influenced early Iberian expansion. Notably, Christopher Columbus himself was a Genoese sailor whose voyage for Spain in 1492 initiated the colonization of Cuba. Even after Columbus, Genoese pioneers were at the vanguard of Spain's Atlantic ventures. In the 15th century, as Spain conquered the Canary Islands off Africa, Genoese investors recognized the island's potential for sugar cultivation. They introduced sugarcane from Sicily and financed the first populations and mills on Gran Canaria and Tenerife. A Genoese entrepreneur, Battista del Ruberol, spent a fortune to build a sugar mill at Galdar. These early Canary Island ingenios sugar estates provided immensely profitable, turning the Canaries into a sugar exporting hub by the early 1500s. Genoese sugar growers and merchants helped thus establish the plantation model that would later spread to the Caribbean. Indeed, on the second voyage in 1493, Columbus brought sugar cane to the New World Hispaniola, and by the 6th century, Cuba too had first cane fields. Genoese and other Italians in Spain's orbit provided technical know-how and capital in these ventures. As Spain's empire grew, Genoese families often followed. Some Genoese settlers in the Canaries and in Spain itself later migrated into the Americas. The Canary Islands became a springboard for Spanish migration into the Caribbean, including Cuba in later centuries. Notably, many 18th and 19th century Cuban colonists were Canary Islanders, Isleños, sent by Spain to populate Cuba. It is likely that among those Isleño families were distant descendants of Italians, Genoese, Sicilian, etc., who had early settled in the Canaries, who were during the sugar boom. In this way, many Genoese influence could quietly filter into Cuba via the Canarian connection. For instance, my heritage genetic group, Spanish in Cuba and in Spain, Canary Islands, is in your grandfather's results reflects the historic migratory link. It suggests that some of your Cuban ancestors came by way of the Canaries, a route traveled by families whose lineage further back might include Genoese or Mediterranean roots. Thus, Genoa's footprint in Cuba often arrived indirectly, riding the currents of Spanish migration policy. A Genoese family that established itself in Spain or the Canaries in the 1500s could generations later have descendants owning a plantation outside Havana or Santiago de Cuba. Trade sugar and the Genoese presence in Cuba. By the 18th century, Cuba became Spain's sugar bowl, and the Genoese merchants took part in this lucrative colonial economy. Genoa's traders were already well positioned in the Atlantic sugar trade, since in the 1600s they had partnered with Spanish merchants in Cadiz to ship colonial goods. In fact, Genoese, alongside French traders, played a key role in marketing Cuban sugar in European markets. Havana, Cuba's principal port, was a bustling hub of ships and merchants by the 18th century. Genoese agents often operated in Genoa's import-export trade, often behind the scenes as financiers or consignees or cargoes. They often handled the flow of zucchero cubano, Cuban sugar, that poured into Spain and the Mediterranean. Some Genoese firms financed sugar mills or extended credit to plantation owners, intertwining themselves in Cuba's sugar economy. For example, records show a Genoese named Bernardo Almandolese Pitaluga, who emigrated to eastern Cuba. He was born in Genoa in 1767 and died in Halguin, Cuba in 1849. Bernardo married into a local Cuban family and likely engaged in trade, perhaps managing sugar or other exports. His story is one of Genoese in colonial Cuba, particularly participating in the island's commerce. He was not alone. During the sugar boom of the 19th century, Cuba attracted many new foreigners, Spaniards from Catalonia and Canary Islands, but also Italians, etc., some of whom were of Ligurian North Italian origins. These merchants exported sugar and coffee and imported European goods, becoming part of the Spain planter merchants elite. 17th century engraving of the harbor of Havana. During the colonial era, Havana's port was the gateway for Cuba's sugar and tobacco exports. Genoese merchant houses, often operating via Cadiz or neutral ports, were active in Havana's trade, sometimes engaging in smuggling to evade Spanish trade restrictions. In fact, Genoese communities under Spanish and later British rule became notorious intermediaries in contraband. By early 1800s, the Genoese enclave in British-held Gibraltar were smuggling more goods into Spanish territories than even official U.S.-Spain trade. Havana's wealth of sugar and tobacco was a prize in illicit trade, and Genoese, with their extensive Mediterranean networks, did not hesitate to partake. Some Genoese or their descendants took up official posts in Cuba's colonial administration as well. Notably, an E. Pitaluga served as a port of Havana administered in the 19th century, a testament to how a family of Genoese origin could ascend to a high position in Cuba. The Pitalugas, like a few other Italic families in Cuba, were involved in the shipping and port management of Havana, critical roles in an island developing on maritime trade. Through sugar trade, port administration, and shipping, Genoese merchant nobles left an imprint on colonial Cuba's economy. The image of Havana's harbor, bustling with tall, masted galleons and fortifications, as seen above, evokes in the world in which these Genoese-Cuban families thrived. Global links, British and German connections. Genoa's reach in the age of the empire was truly transnational. In tracing your grandfather's migration highlights, influences from Britain and Germany emerge alongside Italy and Spain. How do Britain and Germany connect to the Genoese bloodlines in the Spanish Empire? The answer lies in the cosmopolitan web of trade and democracy that Genoese merchants navigated. Genoa's merchants had long-standing trade relationships with Northern Europe. Since medieval times, Genoese galleys carried English wool and German metal southward and took Mediterranean goods northward. By the 16th century, Genoese bankers were competing with German financiers like the Fugger and Welser families of Augsburg for influence at the Spanish court. Emperor Charles V initially granted the German Welsers a colony in Venezuela in the 1520s, but that venture faltered as soon as Genoese financiers supplanted the Germans as Spain's preferred bankers. The rivalry and partnership that meant that some Genoese had close dealings with the Germanic world, whether through banking, marriages, or business alliances. It wouldn't be unusual for a Genoese Casa di Commercio to have an agent or partner in Habsburg or Frankfurt, thereby mingling lineages over time. Britain's connections are even more direct in the context of colonial migration. By the early 1700s, Britain seized Gibraltar from Spain, and interestingly, most of Gibraltar's Spanish civilization population evacuated, leaving about 70 neutral Genoese residents who did not flee. These Genoese became the foundation of Gibraltar's population under British rule. Over the 18th century, Gibraltar's Genoese community grew up and prospered under the Union Jack, often intermarrying with English, Maltese, or Minorcan settlers. On the branch of the Pittaluga family itself was based in Gibraltar in the 1800s. Records show that Andres Pittaluga, who I've actually read of before, born in Gibraltar in 1822 to a Genoese origin family, Pittaluga with a mother from the Spinola family, another Genoese lineage. That Gibraltar-born Pittaluga emigrated to South America and even the Falkland Islands, exemplifying the far-flung journeys and families undertook. What this means for Cuban heritage is that British influences could seep in when Genoese families lived under British domination, like Gibraltar, before coming to Cuba. A Genoese descended person from Gibraltar carrying a British passport, perhaps some English or Maltese blood, could... Alright, it's probably not me, though. Likewise, Central European came through dynastic and mercantile links. The Spanish Habsburgs were also rulers of Austria and connected to the German states. Genoese bankers dealt with all these courts. Some nobles in Spanish service married to the Spanish nobility that the Burgundian, Flemish, Germanic roots, subtly blending bloodlines. Furthermore, the 19th century Spain encouraged migration to Cuba and from all over Europe. As a result, a few German engineers, merchants, and colonists settled in Cuba. If one of your ancestor families married a German immigrant in, say, the 1850s, it would show up as a Germanic genetic signal. But even without a direct Germanic immigrant, centuries of pan-European mingling among the Genoese merchant nobility could imprint minor Germanic traces in the DNA. The Genoese are known to form strategic marriages across Europe to bolster the trade network. A Genoese merchant might take a Flemish, Dutch, Germanic wife in Antwerp or an English wife in London, and later the descendants moved to Cuba under Spanish colors. In short, Genoa's global trade links link it to Britain and Germany, and those sometimes come with ancestral connections. Okay, alright, By the 19th century, families like the Pittaluga in Cuba exemplified Italo-Cuban colonial identity, Spanish-speaking and yet Cuban-born, proud of a distant Genoese lineage and often cosmopolitan in makeup. The Pittaluga surname itself originates in Liguria, Genoa. Historical records indicate the family moved to Spain around the late 15th century for trade purposes. The Pittalugas established themselves as nobles in northern Spain, producing lawyers, landowners, and officials. By the 16th and 17th centuries. By the 18th century, a branch of the family found its way to the Spanish Main and Caribbean. In Cuba, the Pittalugas married into local Creole families, but retained a memory of being Genoveses. In Spanish, of course, Genoese. One 19th century Cuban Pittaluga served as a colonial administrator at the administrating high involvement comments. The blending of Genoese ancestry, Spanish nobility, Cuban birthplace was a characteristic of many merchant families in colonial Havana that might attend the Spanish colonial government functions by day and recount tales of Liguria or Gondon at home by night. In such families, European roots often mix. The Cuban-born Pittaluga in the 1800s might have a Genoese grandfather or a Canary Island grandmother, Spanish with perhaps a dash of Berber or Portuguese from the Canaries, a British-born wife if had commercial ties to Gibraltar, blah, blah, blah. Alright, they embodied the transatlantic trade route made possible. Genoa, Sicily, Spain, Canary Islands, Germany, and Britain, all merging over one family for over 400 years. Such was the nature of merchant nobility in the Spanish Empire, which truly an international Genoese in Cuba were formed part of an elite that was Hispanic in culture, but often Italian, or part English, but part German in blood. They contributed to Cuba's economy through sugar shipping and capital. In return, Cuba gave them a new homeland. In summary, Genoa's connections to colonial Cuba found in enterprising merchants and families who linked the Italian Riviera to Spanish Main, from early sugar ventures in the Canaries to banking the Spanish crown and smuggling British goods into Havana, to running Cuban sugar plantations. The Genoese left subtle but significant traces. They integrated in Spanish colonial society and often carried with them a bit of Ligurian heritage, but occasionally British and German ties picked up along the way. Families like the Pittaluga were a mirror of this history, a tapestry of Italo-Spanish heritage woven into the fabric of colonial Cuba. It is a legacy visible not only in the archives and history books, but even in the genetic migration of highlights of their descendants' migrations later. Such stories give voice to Cuba's diverse colonial heritage, one in which a proud Genoese suburba spirit sailed into the Caribbean and found a new home on the Cuban sun, forever enriching the island's identity. And it had over 34 sources, all over the place. Wow, a lot, right? Yeah, so I mean, yeah, Genoese banked and had a lot of port jobs and things like that, seafarers. Yeah, I myself, I told in other videos, had port faring families. But yeah, that's the video, guys. Yeah, thanks for coming. Yeah, ciao, state buon.